The shocking truth behind a father's controversial marriage. This is a story that came to us from Portland, Oregon, and it's one that shook an entire family to its core. What started as a seemingly outrageous decision by a 72-year-old man to marry a woman less than half his age turned into something nobody could have predicted. This is the true story of Robert Henderson, his unexpected bride Sarah, and the devastating secret that would change everything. Robert Henderson had been a pillar of the Portland community for over 4 decades. He owned a successful chain of hardware stores across the Pacific Northwest, built from the ground up starting in the early 1980s. His wife Margaret had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, leaving Robert alone in their large craftsman-style home in the Pearl District. Their 3 children, Michael, Jennifer, and David, all in their 40s, had watched their father retreat into himself after their mother's death, rarely leaving the house except for work. So when Robert announced at a family dinner in March of last year that he had met someone and was planning to get married, his children were initially thrilled. Their father deserved happiness again. That feeling lasted approximately 15 seconds until Robert introduced them to Sarah Mitchell, a 38-year-old woman with striking blonde hair and an infectious smile who looked young enough to be his granddaughter. The family dinner that night became a disaster. Michael, the eldest at 46 and a corporate lawyer in downtown Portland, immediately stood up and demanded to speak with his father privately. Jennifer, 43 and a middle school teacher, sat frozen in shock, while David, the youngest at 41 and a software engineer, started laughing nervously, convinced it was some kind of elaborate joke. But it wasn't a joke. Robert was completely serious. He and Sarah had met 6 months earlier at a local coffee shop in Northwest Portland, and according to Robert, it was love at first sight. Sarah had been working as a paralegal at a small law firm and was studying to get her bachelor's degree in psychology at Portland State University. She seemed intelligent, articulate, and genuinely interested in Robert, but the age gap was impossible to ignore. The children's initial shock quickly turned into suspicion and anger. Michael hired a private investigator within 48 hours. The investigator, a former police detective named Tom Brennan, spent 3 weeks digging into Sarah's background. What he found seemed to confirm every suspicion the Henderson children had. Sarah had been married twice before, both times to men significantly older than herself. Her first husband had been 63 when they married. She was 24. He died 2 years later, leaving her a modest inheritance. Her second husband was 58 when they wed. She was 32. They divorced after 3 years, and according to court records, Sarah had walked away with a substantial settlement. Armed with this information, Michael confronted his father at the hardware store's main location on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The argument could be heard through the thin office walls. Michael accused Sarah of being a gold digger, a predator targeting vulnerable older men. He showed his father the investigator's report, page by page, detailing Sarah's history with older men and the financial benefits she had gained from those relationships. Robert listened quietly, his weathered hands folded on his desk, and then he said something that stopped Michael cold. He said he already knew everything in that report. Sarah had told him herself, completely voluntarily, during one of their first real conversations. She had been honest about her past, about her mistakes, about the reasons those marriages had failed. And Robert, despite knowing all of it, had chosen to love her anyway. This revelation didn't satisfy Michael or his siblings. If anything, it made them more determined to stop the wedding. They organized what they called an intervention, inviting Robert to Jennifer's house in Lake Oswego on a Sunday afternoon. All 3 children were there, along with their spouses and even some of Robert's longtime friends from the Rotary Club. They had prepared speeches, gathered evidence, and even consulted with a family therapist about how to handle what they believed was a clear case of elder exploitation. The intervention lasted 4 hours. Person after person stood up and pleaded with Robert to reconsider. They talked about Margaret's memory, about family legacy, about the obvious financial motivations. Jennifer cried. Michael's wife, Amanda, presented statistics about age gap relationships and their failure rates. David showed a spreadsheet he had created, calculating how much of the family business and assets could be at risk if the marriage ended in divorce. Robert sat through all of it without interrupting. When everyone had finished, he stood up slowly, his 72-year-old frame still imposing at 6 feet tall. He thanked everyone for their concern. He acknowledged that from the outside, the relationship looked suspicious. Then he said something that silenced the room. He said that for 3 years after Margaret died, he had wanted to die too. Every morning he woke up was another day of unbearable loneliness. He had considered ending his own life on more than one occasion. And then he met Sarah, and for the first time since losing his wife, he felt alive again. The wedding was scheduled for June 15th at a small vineyard in the Willamette Valley. Despite their father's emotional confession, none of the Henderson children planned to attend. Michael had even consulted with attorneys about the possibility of having Sarah sign a prenuptial agreement or challenging his father's mental competency, though both options seemed legally problematic and morally questionable. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, something unexpected happened. Jennifer received a phone call from Sarah asking if they could meet for coffee. Jennifer almost said no, but something in Sarah's voice, a note of genuine desperation, made her agree. They met at a Starbucks in Beaverton on a Tuesday morning. What Sarah told Jennifer over the next 2 hours would begin to unravel everything the Henderson children thought they knew. Sarah explained that she wasn't asking Jennifer to accept the marriage or even to attend the wedding. She just wanted Jennifer to understand something important. Sarah began to tell her story, the real story that the private investigator's report hadn't captured. Sarah grew up in a deeply troubled home in rural Idaho. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 6, and her mother struggled with severe depression and prescription drug addiction. By the time Sarah was 15, she was essentially raising her 2 younger siblings while trying to finish high school. She met her first husband, Richard, when she was working as a waitress at a truck stop diner right after graduation. He was a regular customer, kind and stable, everything her chaotic home life wasn't. Yes, he was much older, but he offered her something she had never had: safety and security. When Richard died suddenly of a heart attack, Sarah was devastated. She had genuinely loved him, despite what outsiders assumed. The small inheritance he left her allowed her to finally go to community college, something she had dreamed of but could never afford. Her second marriage to Charles had started with genuine affection, but it deteriorated when she discovered he had been lying about his financial situation and had significant gambling debts. The divorce settlement had indeed been substantial, but it had also been necessary because Charles had taken out loans in her name without her knowledge. Jennifer listened, still skeptical but beginning to see Sarah as a real person rather than a caricature. Then Sarah said something that changed everything. She told Jennifer that she had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer 4 months ago. She had started chemotherapy 3 weeks before she met Robert at that coffee shop. She hadn't been looking for love or money. She had been trying to work up the courage to go home and face the reality of fighting cancer alone. Robert had noticed her distress that day. He had sat down across from her and simply asked if she was okay. She had broken down and told this complete stranger everything. And instead of walking away, Robert had stayed. He had held her hand while she cried. He had driven her to her next chemotherapy appointment. He had been there for every treatment since then. Their relationship hadn't been built on romance or physical attraction. It had been built on Robert's extraordinary kindness during the darkest period of Sarah's life. Sarah explained to Jennifer that she had tried to push Robert away. She told him she was too sick, too young, too complicated. She'd been completely honest about her past because she wanted to give him every reason to leave. But Robert had refused. He said that after watching Margaret suffer through cancer, he knew exactly what Sarah was facing, and he couldn't bear the thought of her going through it alone. He wanted to marry her, not despite her illness, but because of it. He wanted to make sure she had health insurance through his company. He wanted to be able to make medical decisions for her if she became incapacitated. He wanted to take care of her the way he hadn't been able to cure Margaret. Jennifer sat in that Starbucks, tears streaming down her face, as Sarah pulled up her sleeve to show the port in her arm for chemotherapy. Sarah hadn't told the Henderson children about her cancer because Robert had asked her not to. He didn't want his children to accept the marriage out of pity. He wanted them to accept Sarah because they could see what he saw in her, a brave, intelligent woman who deserved love and support. Sarah told Jennifer that she knew she might not survive her cancer. The prognosis was uncertain. She had maybe a 60% chance of 5-year survival with aggressive treatment. She didn't want Robert's money or his business. In fact, she had insisted on signing a prenuptial agreement that Robert had initially refused to even consider. She had drafted it herself, stating that if the marriage ended for any reason, including her death, she would receive nothing beyond what was legally required for her medical care. Jennifer immediately called her brothers. They met at Michael's office that afternoon, and Jennifer told them everything Sarah had shared. The brothers were stunned. Michael, ever the lawyer, wanted documentation and proof. David was angry that their father had kept this from them. But slowly, the anger began to transform into something else: shame. They had been so focused on protecting their father from a perceived threat that they had completely failed to see what was actually happening. Their father, still grieving the loss of his wife to cancer, had found another person suffering from the same disease and had chosen compassion over fear. He had chosen to love someone who desperately needed it, fully aware that he might lose her, just as he had lost Margaret. That wasn't foolishness or manipulation. That was courage. The Henderson children asked to meet with both Robert and Sarah together. They gathered at the same house where the intervention had taken place, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Michael spoke first. He apologized directly to Sarah, acknowledging that they had judged her without knowing her, that they had reduced her to a stereotype without seeing her humanity. Jennifer apologized for not trusting their father's judgment. David apologized for putting finances above family. Sarah accepted their apologies with grace, understanding their initial reaction. She shared more about her treatment plan, her doctors at OHSU, and her hopes for the future. Robert held her hand throughout the conversation, and for the first time, his children could see what their father had seen from the beginning: genuine love and partnership. The wedding on June 15th was beautiful. All 3 Henderson children attended, along with their families. Jennifer helped Sarah get ready, noting how the chemotherapy had thinned Sarah's hair but hadn't diminished her spirit. Michael walked Sarah down the aisle alongside Robert's brother, since Sarah's own family relationships remained strained. David gave a toast that left not a dry eye in the house, talking about how his father had taught him what real love looked like, choosing to care for someone even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when you know you might lose them. But this story doesn't end at the wedding. What happened over the next year would prove to be even more remarkable, and, in many ways, more shocking than anything that had come before. Sarah's cancer treatment was brutal. The chemotherapy made her violently ill. She lost all her hair. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed. Robert was by her side through all of it, just as he had been with Margaret. But there was a crucial difference this time. Sarah was younger and stronger, and she fought the disease with everything she had. The Henderson children, who had initially been so hostile to Sarah, became her fiercest supporters. Jennifer drove her to appointments when Robert had to work. Michael helped navigate the complex insurance and medical billing issues. David researched alternative treatments and support groups. 8 months after the wedding, Sarah's oncologist delivered news that shocked everyone. The cancer was in remission. The tumors had responded better to treatment than anyone had dared to hope. Sarah would need ongoing monitoring and maintenance therapy, but the immediate threat had passed. The celebration at the Henderson house that night was joyous, with Robert crying tears of relief and gratitude. But as Sarah regained her health, something unexpected began to emerge. The real shocking twist in the story wasn't what the Henderson children had originally feared. It wasn't financial exploitation or manipulation. It was something none of them had anticipated. As Sarah recovered and began to feel like herself again, she started to struggle with the reality of her marriage. She loved Robert deeply, but she began to realize that her feelings for him were more those of profound gratitude and affection rather than romantic love. She had been so sick when they married, so desperate and scared that she hadn't fully processed what a lifetime commitment to someone more than 3 decades older would actually mean. Sarah confided in Jennifer first during one of their now regular coffee meetings. She felt trapped by her own gratitude. How could she possibly tell Robert that she was having doubts when he had literally saved her life? How could she admit that as she regained her health and her future, she was beginning to want different things than what their marriage offered? Jennifer, showing remarkable wisdom and compassion, suggested that Sarah talk to a therapist. Sarah found a counselor who specialized in relationships and life transitions, and over several months of therapy, she came to a difficult realization. She needed to be honest with Robert, even if it meant risking the most important relationship in her life. On a cool October evening, nearly 18 months after their wedding, Sarah sat down with Robert in their living room and told him the truth. She explained that she would always love him, that he had given her the will to survive when she had been ready to give up. But she also admitted that she wasn't sure she could be the wife he deserved. She was only 39 years old, cancer-free, and beginning to envision a future that included things Robert had already experienced, maybe children of her own, career ambitions that would require years of dedication, adventures and risks that a man in his 70s might not be able to share. Robert's response was not what Sarah expected. He didn't cry or get angry. Instead, he smiled sadly and told her that he had known this moment might come. He had married Sarah, knowing the enormous age gap between them. He had done it because she needed support during her cancer battle, and he had been genuinely prepared to spend whatever time they had together making her happy. But he had also known that if she survived, if she beat the cancer and reclaimed her life, she might outgrow their relationship. Then Robert said something that revealed the true depth of his character. He told Sarah that he would not keep her in a marriage that made her feel trapped or obligated. He loved her enough to let her go if that's what she needed. However, he asked for one thing, that she take time to be absolutely certain, and that they explore every option before making any final decisions. They spent the next 3 months in couples counseling. The Henderson children, who by now had grown to genuinely love Sarah, were devastated by the news. But in a show of remarkable growth, they refused to take sides. Michael, Jennifer, and David made it clear to both their father and Sarah that they would support whatever decision was made, as long as it was made with honesty and care. The counseling revealed something interesting. Robert and Sarah did genuinely love each other, but they loved each other in a way that didn't necessarily fit the traditional model of marriage. Their bond had been forged in crisis, built on mutual support and deep respect, but it lacked the romantic passion and shared life vision that sustains most long-term marriages. The therapist suggested something unconventional. What if they redefined their relationship rather than ending it? After much discussion and soul-searching, Robert and Sarah made a decision that shocked everyone all over again, but this time in a different way. They decided to remain married, but to restructure their relationship into what they called a companionate marriage. They would maintain separate bedrooms, giving Sarah more independence and privacy. Sarah would be free to pursue her education and career goals without the expectation of traditional wifely duties. Robert would have a partner and companion, someone to share meals and conversations with, someone to care for and be cared by, but without the pressure of maintaining a romantic relationship that didn't feel authentic to either of them. More controversially, they agreed that Sarah would be free to date other people her age with complete transparency and Robert's knowledge. Robert, for his part, said he had no interest in dating anyone else but appreciated the option being available. They updated their prenuptial agreement to reflect these new terms, ensuring that both of them were protected legally. The Henderson children struggled to understand this arrangement initially. It seemed to them like their father was being taken advantage of in a new and different way. But as they watched the relationship evolve over the following months, they began to see something beautiful and unconventional. Robert was genuinely happy. He had companionship without loneliness, purpose without obligation. Sarah was thriving, finishing her bachelor's degree with honors while working at a nonprofit that supported cancer patients. Then came the detail that would ultimately prove to be the most shocking aspect of this entire story. the revelation that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew. It came to light during a family gathering for Robert's 74th birthday, about 2.5 years after the original wedding announcement. Sarah had been dating a man named Marcus, a 42-year-old architect, for about 6 months. She'd been open with Robert about the relationship, and Robert had even met Marcus a few times. The Henderson children found this arrangement bizarre, but had grudgingly accepted it as part of their father's unusual but seemingly functional marriage. At the birthday party, Sarah asked if she could make an announcement. Standing next to both Robert and Marcus, she revealed that she was pregnant. The room fell completely silent. Jennifer felt like she might faint. Michael's jaw literally dropped. David looked back and forth between the three people standing together, trying to process what this meant. Then Sarah explained. The baby was Marcus's biologically conceived during their relationship. But she and Marcus had spent months discussing what this meant for their future, and they had made a decision together with Robert's full knowledge and support. Marcus wanted to be fully involved as the baby's father. Sarah wanted to raise the child, and Robert, incredibly, had agreed to help raise the baby as well, serving as a grandfather figure and providing stability and support. This arrangement seemed insane to almost everyone present. The Henderson children immediately assumed that Sarah had finally shown her true colors, that she was taking advantage of their father's kindness to an absurd degree. How could she possibly expect a 74-year-old man to help raise another man's baby? But as Robert stood up to speak, he silenced the room once again with his wisdom and grace. He explained that when Margaret was dying, she had made him promise something. She had made him promise that he wouldn't let grief destroy the rest of his life, that he would find joy and purpose wherever he could. Supporting Sarah through her cancer had fulfilled that promise initially, and now, helping to welcome a new life into the world, a child who would bring joy and chaos and meaning, that felt like the most profound way to honor Margaret's wish. Robert acknowledged that the situation was unconventional. He knew people would judge them, but he said that life was too short to live according to other people's expectations. He had spent 74 years being conventional, building a business, raising a family, doing everything right. And now, in what might be the final chapter of his life, he wanted to do something radical. He wanted to choose love and support over judgment and fear. The Henderson children were forced to confront something difficult. Their father wasn't being taken advantage of. He was making an informed, conscious choice to structure his life in a way that brought him meaning and joy, even if it didn't look like what they thought his life should look like. The question wasn't whether Sarah was exploiting him. The question was whether his own children could love and support him enough to accept his choices. It took time, but eventually, all three Henderson children came to terms with the situation. They realized that their initial reaction to Sarah and their ongoing struggle to understand their father's choices had never really been about protecting him. It had been about protecting their own image of who their father should be, their own comfort with conventional life structures, their own inheritance and legacy. They had wrapped all of that up in concern for their father's well-being, but at its core, it had been about them, not him. The baby, a girl named Margaret Rose after Robert's late wife, was born on a sunny day in May. Marcus was present for the birth, as was Robert. The Henderson children met their fathers. Well, what was she exactly? Not his granddaughter, not really his daughter, but a child who would be part of his life and therefore part of theirs. Jennifer held little Margaret and cried, thinking about how she had almost missed out on knowing this child because of her own prejudice and fear. Now, 2 years after that initial shocking announcement about the wedding, the Henderson family has evolved into something no one could have predicted. Robert, now 76, splits his time between his hardware business and helping care for Margaret Rose. Sarah completed her bachelor's degree and is working on a master's in social work, specializing in oncology patient support. Marcus is a regular presence in Robert's home, and the two men have developed an unlikely but genuine friendship. The Henderson children have learned to embrace the unconventional nature of their expanded family. But the story doesn't end there. There's one more revelation, one final piece of information that recontextualizes everything that came before. It emerged during a family dinner last month as everyone gathered to celebrate Margaret Rose's second birthday. Robert stood up to make a toast, and he began by thanking everyone for their patience and love over the past few tumultuous years. Then he shared something he had kept private until now. About a year before he met Sarah, Robert had received his own devastating diagnosis. He had been told he had early-stage Parkinson's disease. The tremors were still minor, barely noticeable, but the prognosis was clear. He would gradually decline, losing motor control and eventually cognitive function over the next decade or two. Robert had told no one, not even his children. After Margaret died, facing a future of slow deterioration alone had seemed unbearable. He had genuinely considered ending his life before the disease could take away his dignity and independence. And then he had met Sarah, a woman fighting desperately to survive, and her courage had shamed him into reconsidering his own despair. Every choice Robert had made since meeting Sarah had been informed by this diagnosis. He had married her knowing his time was limited. He had restructured their marriage into a companionate arrangement, partly because he knew his physical decline might make a traditional romantic relationship impossible eventually. He had agreed to help raise Marcus and Sarah's baby because he wanted to spend his remaining good years surrounded by life and joy rather than decline and sorrow. The Henderson children were devastated to learn about their father's diagnosis, angry that he had kept it from them. But Robert explained that he had wanted to protect them. Yes, but he had also wanted to live his final years on his own terms, making his own choices without his children's well-meaning interference. The whole situation with Sarah, which had seemed so scandalous and concerning from the outside, had actually been Robert's way of taking control of his own narrative, of choosing how he would spend his remaining time. In retrospect, everything made sense. The rushed wedding, which had seemed suspicious, had been motivated by Robert's desire to ensure Sarah had medical coverage before his condition worsened and he could no longer manage his business effectively. The unconventional marriage arrangement had been his way of giving Sarah freedom while still providing her with support. His willingness to help raise Margaret Rose had been his way of ensuring he would be surrounded by purpose and joy as his health declined. As Robert finished his explanation at that birthday dinner, the room was silent except for the sound of little Margaret Rose laughing and playing with her toys, completely unaware of the complex web of love, fear, illness, and hope that had brought her into this unusual family. Michael, Jennifer, and David realized that from the very beginning, their father had been the wisest person in the room. He had understood something they hadn't, that life is fragile and precious, that conventional rules and judgments matter far less than love and support, that the time we have with each other is too short to waste on fear and suspicion. The shocking truth behind Robert Henderson's controversial marriage to a woman 34 years his junior wasn't about money or exploitation or manipulation. It was about two people facing mortality, each in their own way, and choosing to face it together. It was about a man deciding to spend his final healthy years not in comfortable isolation, but in radical acts of love and service. It was about a family learning to let go of their expectations and embrace something messy and unconventional and ultimately beautiful. Today, Robert's Parkinson's symptoms are slowly progressing. Some days his hands shake too much to hold his coffee cup. He's had to step back from the day-to-day operations of his hardware business, though he still serves as chairman of the board. Michael has taken over as CEO, with David managing the company's technology infrastructure and Jennifer serving as director of human resources, bringing the whole family into the business together. Sarah lives in the house with Robert, along with Margaret Rose. Marcus has his own apartment nearby, but spends most evenings and weekends at the house. They share meals together, this unconventional family unit. The Henderson grandchildren, Michael, Jennifer, and David's kids, have accepted little Margaret as their cousin because, what else would you call her? The family that had almost been torn apart by suspicion and fear has instead expanded and deepened in ways none of them could have imagined. The Henderson children learned something profound through this experience. They learned that protecting someone you love doesn't mean controlling their choices or shielding them from risk. It means trusting them, supporting them, and being willing to expand your own understanding of what family and love can look like. They learned that the things that seem most shocking from the outside often make perfect sense once you understand the full context. And they learned that their father, even in his 70s, even facing a degenerative disease, even making choices that seemed bizarre and questionable, was still teaching them how to live with courage and integrity. When people in Portland hear about Robert Henderson and his unusual family situation, they often react with judgment and suspicion, just as Henderson children initially did. They see a 76-year-old man married to a 40-year-old woman, living with her boyfriend, and raising a child that belongs to neither of them, and they make assumptions about manipulation and dysfunction. But those who know the family well, who understand the full story, see something different. They see a man who faced the twin terrors of loneliness and terminal illness and responded not with bitterness or withdrawal, but with radical openness and love. They see a woman who survived cancer and was given a second chance at life, who is using that second chance to build a career helping other cancer patients while raising a daughter in an environment of unconventional but profound support. They see a young girl growing up surrounded by people who chose to love her and each other, not because biology or convention dictated it, but because they actively decided that love and family are what you make them. The shocking truth at the heart of this story is ultimately simple. Robert Henderson's controversial marriage was never about what his children feared it was about. It was about a man who understood that life's meaning comes not from playing it safe or following the rules, but from showing up for the people who need you, even when it's complicated, even when people judge you, even when you know it might break your heart. As Robert sits in his favorite chair in the living room, watching Sarah help Marcus give Margaret Rose a bath, his hands trembling slightly from the Parkinson's, he reflects on the journey of the past few years. He has no regrets. He thinks about Margaret, his first wife, and knows she would approve of everything he's done. She had always valued kindness over convention, love over judgment. The hardware stores that Robert built over 40 years will continue after he's gone, now run by his children working together. The money and assets that his children had once worried about protecting will be divided fairly, according to a will that ensures Sarah is taken care of but doesn't exclude his children or their families. The prenuptial agreement that Sarah insisted on still stands, modified only to ensure Margaret Rose has a college fund and Sarah has security without taking anything from the Henderson children's inheritance. But more important than any of that, Robert has created something that can't be divided or inherited. A legacy of choosing love in the face of fear, of embracing life even when death is approaching, of building family not on the foundation of biology or convention, but on the more solid ground of conscious choice and mutual support. The Henderson children, who started this journey convinced they needed to save their father from a terrible mistake, ended up being the ones who were saved. They were saved from becoming rigid and judgmental. They were saved from valuing inheritance over relationship, convention over compassion. They were saved from living safe, small lives governed by fear of what others might think. This story from Portland, Oregon is shocking not because of the age gap or the unconventional marriage arrangement or even the unusual family structure that has emerged. It's shocking because it challenges our deepest assumptions about what love, family, and a life well lived should look like. It forces us to ask ourselves, are we willing to let go of our preconceptions and judgments long enough to see the humanity and wisdom in choices that look nothing like our own? Robert Henderson is 76 years old, living with Parkinson's disease, married to a woman nearly 4 decades younger, helping to raise a child that isn't his, sharing his home with his wife's boyfriend, and he will tell you without hesitation that these have been the happiest, most meaningful years of his life. The real shock isn't what he's done. The real shock is that most of us lack the courage to do the same, to prioritize love over fear, to choose meaning over convention, to build the family and the life we actually want rather than the one we think we're supposed to have. And that's the true story from Portland, a story that started with scandal and suspicion, but ended up being about something far more profound, the incredible capacity of human beings to surprise us, to grow, to love in ways we never expected, and to create beauty and meaning in the most unlikely circumstances. The Henderson family is not perfect. Their situation is messy and complicated and sometimes difficult. But it is also real and loving and ultimately triumphant over the forces of judgment, fear, and conventional thinking that might have destroyed it. As for what the future holds, no one knows. Robert's health will continue to decline. Sarah and Marcus's relationship may or may not last. Margaret Rose will grow up and form her own opinions about her unusual family. The Henderson siblings will continue to navigate the complex dynamics of their expanded family. But whatever happens, they will face it together with the wisdom and courage that Robert Henderson taught them through his shocking, scandalous, and ultimately beautiful choice to marry a woman named Sarah and to build a life based on love rather than fear. This is the real story behind the 72-year-old man who married a 38-year-old woman and sent his children into a panic. It's not the story anyone expected. It's not the story that fits neatly into our assumptions about May-December romances or gold diggers or family dynamics. It's better than that. It's more complicated, more human, and ultimately more hopeful than any simple narrative of exploitation or scandal could ever be. It's a story about what happens when we let go of our need to control and judge, when we open ourselves to possibilities we never imagined, when we choose courage over comfort. It's a story that reminds us that the people we love are capable of surprising us, that the situations that look most alarming from the outside often contain hidden depths of wisdom and grace, and that family, in the end, is defined not by biology or convention, but by the conscious choice to show up for each other day after day in whatever form that takes. And perhaps most importantly, it's a story that challenges each of us to ask, when faced with the unconventional choices of someone we love, will we react with suspicion and judgment, or with curiosity and compassion? Will we try to force them back into the boxes we've created for them? Or will we expand our own understanding to make room for their truth? The Henderson children chose the latter, and in doing so, they didn't just preserve their relationship with their father. They became better, wiser, more compassionate people themselves. That's the shocking truth at the heart of this story from Portland, Oregon. Not exploitation or manipulation or scandal, but transformation, growth, and the radical power of love to reshape our lives in ways we never thought possible.